Fouché, after his disgrace, retired to his chateau at Pontcarré, but first took care to carry off with him or to destroy the most important papers at his ministry. The emperor, not wishing to leave his letters in the hands of a man whom he considered capable of making a bad use of them, sent Prince de Neufchâtel-Berthier and his friend to the Councillor of State Real to ask for these papers, but Fouché persisted in denying that he had carried off any papers, although the emperor was extremely irritated by Fouché's disguised refusal. He did not wish to take steps against him. Reflection having inspired the ex-minister with the fear of the consequences of the emperor's resentment, he ended by making up his mind to hand over Napoleon's letters. Napoleon, being unwilling to leave the restless mind of this dangerous intriguer without food, and especially wishing to remove him from France, appointed him governor-general of the Illyrian provinces. He had later on reason to repent not having put it out of the power of this unhallowed individual to do harm. More than one ambition was aroused by the vacancy at the Ministry of Police. The emperor had reserved this portfolio in petto for General Savary, who afterwards became Duke de Rovigo, and who at that time was one of his aides-de-camp. He was anxious in rewarding the services of this general officer to employ his talents and his devotion to his person in a useful manner. Duke de Marais had proposed Senator Simonville, which, without speaking unjustly, was a mistake on his part. Napoleon had not replied negatively. Accordingly, when one day he told Monsieur de Bassano that he would declare his choice on the morrow, the Duke thought the chances in favor of his protege and advised him in a confidential manner to go to St. Cloud. Monsieur de Simonville arrived provided with a parcel which contained his senator's coat and sword and the hat with the white feathers, and waited with anxiety at Madame de Bassano's house. On leaving Mass, the emperor ordered Monsieur de Bassano and General Savary to be brought to his cabinet. The latter, who had no idea of the favor in store for him, was just preparing to return to Paris, his week's service being terminated. The general was on a call to Madame de Bassano when he saw an outrider from the imperial stables ride up leading a horse, who told him that the emperor wished to see him at once. Savary, who could not mount on horseback in shoes and stockings, asked for the loan of a pair of the Duke's riding boots. Bassano had immense calves, so that Savary had all the room he wanted in his boots. Savary put his shoes in his pockets so as to have them in readiness to put on again before entering into the emperor's presence, jumped on the horse which had been brought for him, and rode off on a gallop to the palace. The emperor, who was tired of waiting, was just going out when the general arrived. Great was the latter's surprise, and no less the surprise of the Duke de Bassano, who was in the emperor's cabinet, when Napoleon, addressing the latter and pointing to General Savary, said, "Here is my minister of police." It was a coup de théâtre, which was repeated at Madame de Bassano's house in front of Monsieur de Simonville, when the Duke, bringing Savary back, told them both, "Here is the minister of police." In the meantime, General Foy arrived in Paris. He had been sent by Marshal Massena to explain to the emperor the critical position in which the French army found itself before Lisbon at the end of 1810. Napoleon, wishing to reoccupy Portugal, which General Junot had been forced to abandon after the Convention of Sintra, had charged Marshal Massena with this important operation. Prince d'Essling had prefaced the invasion of Portugal with the taking of the towns of Ciudad Rodrigo and Almeida. After the defeat at the Battle of Busaco, he had arrived in front of the lines of Torres Vedras, an immense entrenchment covering over 15 leagues, at which the English general had been working for the past 6 months, and which was defended by an Anglo-Portuguese army which was 3 times greater than ours. Not being able to attack these formidable lines face to face, the marshal was forced to blockade it whilst waiting for reinforcements. He then decided to send General Foy to the emperor to acquaint him with the state of affairs, to ask him for instructions and especially for funds. General Foy, who in this campaign had displayed courage and talent, was only known to Napoleon by the opposition which he had always manifested against the imperial government. A friend of General Moreau and of General Lecourbe, he had shown himself very partial towards the former at the time of his trial. When Napoleon became emperor, General Foy refused him his vote and would not add his name to the congratulations which his comrades addressed to the new Caesar. Foy was colonel of artillery at that time. This inflexibility of principle had not put a stop to his career, for he had been appointed general brigade on his arrival in Portugal. General Foy's antecedents were not, however, calculated to dispose the emperor in his favor. But when Napoleon had listened to him, he showed himself extremely satisfied with the clear way in which the general had answered his numerous questions as to the position of the French army, its operation, and its resources. The emperor was much pleased with this officer, hearing that he had lost his carriages and had run great dangers on his journey. Napoleon ordered a sum of 20,000 francs to be paid to him and appointed him at the same time general of division. He had conceived so high an opinion of General Foy's character and talents that he designed him in petto for the dignity of marshal, a distinction which he also reserved for General Girard and Generals Clausel and Lamarck. Up till 1814, General Foy continued to show the same bravery and the same talents in war. Having returned at that time to private life, he devoted his leisure to study. Elected by the electors of his department to represent them at the Chamber of Deputies, this eminent general became one of the most eloquent of orators. He figured in the ranks of the opposition and showed himself the most indefatigable and the most skilled champion of the guarantees stipulated for it in the Charter, the most resolute adversary of the unpopular laws proposed by the government of the Restoration. He often used to combine with his magnificent speeches in patriotic defense of public liberties attacks against the fallen government, which were not always fair or just. He used at times to tell his friends who blamed him for it that he did this to be consistent. General Foy, animated without any possible doubt by sincere patriotism, charged Napoleon with the commonplace crime of having immolated liberty so as to strike a simultaneous and indirect blow at the illiberal methods of the royal government by warning it of the danger of governing in an arbitrary manner, and by accusing it of favoring it this way, the underhand growth of the counter-revolution, mistaking with this object in view the spirit of the acts of the preceding government. The general did not take sufficiently into consideration the abnormal and extraordinary circumstances in which the holder of the sovereign power had found himself placed. After General Foy's death, there was published a work on the war in the peninsula which this soldier had written during the leisure of peace and of his legislative career. The injustice and the mistakes which disfigure this work, which otherwise is a very remarkable one, are to be attributed, it is said, as much to the author as to the publisher of this book, who in various places has exhibited his ignorance of military matters in the story of the conduct of this war, and a superficial acquaintance with the events which during this period occurred in Spain and Portugal. General Foy had not had the time to finish this work, and only left behind him unfinished notes, on which the history of the war in the peninsula was written. In the month of November 1810, the negotiations opened 8 months previously with the English government for an exchange of prisoners came to an end without any result. These negotiations were being pursued on behalf of France by Monsieur de Moustier, who had been employed with me at the Congress of Lunéville, and on behalf of England by Mr. Mackenzie. The French government had previously proposed various systems of exchange stimulated by the desire to rescue thousands of French prisoners from hideous captivity on the English pontoons. The system of exchange which England seemed to prefer was the exchange of all prisoners, both native and allied, en masse. When it became a question of drawing up the clauses referring to the arrangement which had to be come to in this matter, difficulties arose. the English plenipotentiary adopting, in appearance, the basis agreed upon, wished to insert ambiguous clauses, the result of which would have been that the English government would first of all have withdrawn all the prisoners of English nationalities, exchanging them for an equal number of French prisoners. Now, from the proportion of French and English prisoners, 20,000 prisoners would have remained in England to be exchanged for Spanish prisoners. The liberation of these Spanish prisoners was subordinated to the impractical condition of having to open and follow up preliminary negotiations with the Spanish juntas, which were all independent of each other and which did not compose a regular government. Our wretched countrymen would accordingly have been prisoners for an indefinite time on the English pontoons, for England attached little importance to the lives of the allies who fought for her and who were in her pay. All the efforts of the French government to effect the admission in an agreement of equitable and reciprocal conditions remained without result from the British ministry, and the English negotiator broke off the conferences and pressed for the return of his credentials. This new attempt in favor of the unhappy victims of war failed before the cold and selfish policy of England. The events which I have described in a summary manner are not the only occurrences which marked the year 1810, which was more fruitful in important events than any other year of the empire. 1810 witnessed also the surrender of Hanover to the King of Westphalia, the creation of the Grand Duchy of Frankfurt, the succession to which became the appanage of the Viceroy of Italy, the commencement of the Revolution in America, the signal for which was given by Caracas in separating from the metropolis, and the incorporation of the Valais, of the Hanseatic cities, and of Oldenburg into the empire. The annexation of Valais to the empire followed that of Holland, and Valais became a new department under the name of the Simplon department. The immense development which English commerce had taken in the German Ocean and in the Baltic, where England had important markets, in Heligoland and elsewhere, the evident favor which was accorded to her by the states on the seaboard rendered the system of a continental blockade an illusory one. The uselessness of the efforts made by France to oppose collusion and smuggling and to remedy the inactivity of several governments made Napoleon determined to occupy the German countries situated between these two seas. The edicts of the British Council, in tearing up the charters of European international law, authorized the use of even the most violent measures for combating the odious maritime tyranny of England. It was indispensable for the success of the system which had been adopted for the enfranchisement of the seas that the mouths of the Scout, the Meuse, the Rhine, the Ems, the Weser, and the Elbe should be hermetically closed against the English. The only way of becoming absolutely master of these positions was to place them under French administration. It was for this reason that the French government declared in a Senatus Consultum dated December 14th, 1810, that the Hanseatic cities, Oldenburg, Mecklenburg, and the districts situated at the mouths of the rivers mentioned formed integral parts of the French Empire. These acquisitions of territory formed 10 new departments. To these great events, which are of public notoriety, I must add the recital of certain facts of less general interest, which happened about the same time. A singular occurrence added a fresh grievance to all those which the emperor already had against Monsieur de Talleyrand, and increased the latter's rancor. Talleyrand had a nephew, Augustus de Talleyrand, who had sought in marriage a rich heiress of Orleans. This lady's guardian insisted that the suitor should prove himself possessed of a fortune of 300,000 francs before granting his ward's hand. Monsieur Augustus de Talleyrand applied to his uncle, who consented to advance him the sum, his nephew hoping to be able to refund the advance in time. The promissory note which he signed remained in the hands of his uncle, who promised not to let it pass out of his possession. Later on, however, Monsieur de Talleyrand, being himself short on money, passed the note on to a third person, who came and asked Augustus de Talleyrand to pay it. He was at that time ambassador to Switzerland. Surprised by this sudden demand, his first impulse was to accuse his uncle of having broken faith. Madame Auguste de Talleyrand, greatly upset by this occurrence, started off at once for Paris from Bern. She presented herself at the Emperor's levee, her husband being one of the Emperor's chamberlains, and told him of the difficulties in which Monsieur de Talleyrand had cast his own nephew. Napoleon, informed of all the circumstances, summoned his arch-chancellor and ordered him to express his displeasure to Monsieur de Talleyrand for the disgrace which his way of behaving had brought upon a man who was representing France abroad, and finally insisted that the note should be called in without delay. Monsieur de Talleyrand was forced to comply, but this direct interference from the emperor in his family affairs seemed to him a gratuitous provocation and awoke in him a resentment which poured a fresh dose of gall into his heart. In these days of extraordinary fortunes, two French women who had started from lowly origins acquired an influence in the East which, on more than one occasion, they placed at the service of their countrymen. One of these modern Roxolanas was the wife of an infantry sergeant and had been a sutler to the regiment in which her husband had served during the French expedition to Egypt. The chances of war threw her into the power of the Pasha of Jerusalem, claimed by order of General Kleber, at that time in command of the French army in Egypt. This woman, satisfied with her new position and being in the Pasha's good graces, refused to give up these advantages to return to the precarious position which she had formerly occupied. She remained after that time in the Pasha's court in Jerusalem, but never forgot in the midst of her splendor that she was a French woman and a Christian. She used the influence which she owed to the Pasha's favor accordingly in protecting the Christian establishments in Syria. Napoleon, having heard of this, gave order to our consuls to put themselves in communication with her and to profit by her influence. She rendered them certain services for which she was rewarded. Another French woman, a Corsican from Bologna, had been taken prisoner by the Barbary pirates who sold her to the Sultan of Morocco. He made her his favorite. She had a brother in France whom she thought it her right to recommend to the emperor. Napoleon, yielding to the influence of this woman's strange destiny, was anxious to respond to the confidence which his countrywoman had placed in him. He accordingly gave orders that this brother should be found, and was disposed to do something for him, but was obliged to abandon this project on hearing that the man could neither read nor write, and was totally unfitted for anything. The story of Rustam, Napoleon's famous Mameluke, in some ways resembles these extraordinary destinies. I will accordingly take this opportunity of recording it. Rustam received one day a letter from his mother, who was a slave, I believe, in Turkey. She wrote to her son, of whose good position in France she had heard, to give him her news. Rustam was transported with joy on hearing that his mother was still alive. Napoleon ordered me to answer the letter and to ask Rustam's mother what he could do for her. But my letter, for what reason I do not know, was never answered. Rustam was born in Georgia, and his father, who had become doctor to the Pasha, had sent for his wife to join him with their two children. Pirates kidnapped the three during their journey and divided the prisoners amongst themselves. Rustam, sold in Egypt, was brought up in the house of Khuraim Bey of Alexandria in the Mameluke novitiate. After the death of the Bey, sentenced by court-martial as guilty of having communicated with the English fleet, Napoleon took Rustam into his service and brought him back to France. Rustam was still in ignorance of what had become of his mother and his sister. He accompanied Napoleon on all of his journeys, acting as his outrider and occasionally as his valet. He had become inseparable from Napoleon, and no picture of Napoleon was ever painted without the silhouette of his Mameluke being placed behind the emperor's portrait. Rustam adapted himself entirely to French customs. He married a daughter of one of the emperor's ushers and had several children by her. At the time of the abdication in 1814, Rustam could not stand the test of adversity. He disappeared from Fontainebleau on the eve of the day which Napoleon was to leave France for the island of Elba, carrying off a sum of money which had been given to him to compensate his wife for the prejudice which his absence might cause her, his weariness of the agitated life which he had been forced to lead for so long a time, the uncertainty of the future, and the pleasures of the domestic hearth weighed more in his eyes than the fidelity which he owed to Napoleon, and blinded him to the ingratitude of which he was guilty in abandoning a master who had loaded him with acts of kindness.